afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Women in Economics Climate Action What Do Economists Think event. Today's event is being co-hosted by New South Wales and Victoria WEN committees. My name is Kim Mundy. I am a senior economist and currency strategist at CommBank, and I'm also a member of the New South Wales WEN committee. And I will be facilitating today's event. So I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. For me, that is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. For today's event, we have gathered together an excellent panel of economists and public policy specialists who will provide their insights and expertise on the challenge and opportunities of climate change for Australia's economy. Our panelists are Claire Ibrahim. Claire is a director in Deloitte Access Economics, economic analysis and public policy team with expertise in microeconomic analysis, economic scenario modelling, and public policy reform agendas. Prior to joining Deloitte, she worked in the Queensland public sector, focusing on economic and fiscal policy development. Claire is passionate about using economics to answer how structural change impacts society, leading projects across governments, the private sector, and Australia's major institutions. Claire's recent research looks at the economic impacts of different climate change scenarios and policy responses to them on Australia, as well as in the Asia Pacific, Europe, and the United States. We also have with us today Alison Reeve. Alison is the Climate Change and Energy Deputy Program Director at Grattan Institute. She has 2 decades of experience in climate change, clean energy policy and technology in the private, public, academic, and not-for-profit sectors. Alison was previously the General Manager of Project Delivery at the Australian Renewable Energy Agency and a visiting fellow at the Australian National University. She led development of Australia's National Hydrogen Strategy in 2019, as well as Commonwealth policy for offshore wind, energy innovation, energy efficiency, and structural adjustment. We also have with us today Dr. Syezlin Hasan. Syezlin is a research fellow at the Australian Rivers Institute at Griffith University. She is an economist with research, consulting, and teaching experience in topics relating to environmental economics. Syezlin's research is interdisciplinary, bridging the scientific research findings to policy via economic analyses. She works collaboratively with members of her research team across a wide range of topics, including, but not limited to, climate change adaptation in the Pacific, the conversion of agricultural land to alternative uses to improve water quality in the Great Barrier Reef, and the newly evolving field of ecosystem accounting under the United Nations Statistical Commission's System of Environmental Economic Accounting, ecosystem accounting. And finally, but definitely not least, we have Dr. Marit Kragt. Marit currently works as an Associate Professor at the University of Western Australia School of Agriculture and Environment. Associate Professor Kragt's research focuses on improving agricultural and natural resource management decisions. Her expertise includes climate change mitigation and adaptation in agriculture, integrated farm systems modelling, adoption of sustainable management practices, and economic valuation of non-market impacts. She was an ArcDECRA Fellow from 2016 to 2020. Marit also holds roles as PBC and Director of the Centre for Agricultural Economics and Development at the University of Western Australia. So as you can see, we have 4 absolutely incredible women with us today. They will each run through a brief presentation before we move into a moderated panel discussion. But we will also have some time for Q&A at the end of the event. So please do submit your questions at the Q&A button down the bottom of the screen, and we will do our best to get through them all. Also, just so you know, today's event will be recorded and it will be available on the ESA webpage and the WEN YouTube channel. Also, as a reminder, if you do want to support WEN's goal to promote greater gender balance in economics, then please consider becoming a WEN member. But for now, I think we should get straight into the presentations. So first up, we have Claire from Deloitte. Over to you. Thanks, Claire.
Thank you so much, Kim, and thank you for the great panelists for being here today for a good discussion. I'm really looking forward to it. I thought in terms of my presentation, I would really just start by giving the background to the economic thinking that's underpinned the work we've been doing here at Deloitte Access Economics for several years now on the economics of climate change, and particularly the focus on Australia's transition and structural adjustment journey. So for us, it really came back to the starting point of needing to use the economics discipline to unpack the stalemate on climate in Australia's policy discourse. So why were we failing to have movement in terms of a policy direction that we would thought result in meaningful change to put Australia on a new path of structural adjustment that would really allow us to minimise the downside risks of physical climate change and maximise the economic upside that we were quite sure would come from transitioning to a new path of economic growth that is low emissions and leads to net zero. So in starting to unpack that, we felt the economic framework at which we were approaching this was really wrong. We were all coming at it from the perspective that action on climate would actually be more costly than choosing not to change. And so really in starting to unpack that, what we wanted to look at was that no change is certainly a choice, but it's not costless. And that really came back to the basics of needing to integrate a view to the physical consequences of climate change into the way we think about our economic growth paths and our trend outlook, and the way we start to then factor in that that is this new baseline on which we are transitioning away from, and what the differences in avoided costs and benefits are attached to that. And we've kind of been calling that how economies can reach their turning point. So the point at which the various costs and benefits associated with the structural adjustment actually begin to pay off. That's both in terms of mitigating physical risks associated with the different climate pathways, particularly limiting global average warming to as close to 1.5 degrees as possible, kind of noting at the moment the consequences of the locked-in climate change till at least 2050, depending on which kind of scenario you're thinking about. But then also those benefits of getting the structural adjustment right, in particular getting the pace, scale and sequencing of that transition right. In Australia's highly place-based industry structure, which we know really matters for economic policy settings, and thinking about the types of investments that have to be made to get that payoff right, to reach that economic turning point at which the economy is net better off for having made that change to decarbonise. And so starting to unpack the economics of that and thinking that through, some of the recent work that we've done for the Business Council of Australia and looking at their kind of net zero policy position really demonstrated that the baseline that we saw a pathway basically of no further significant change from today, both in Australia and across the world, leading to around 3 degrees of global average warming towards the end of the century, put Australia on a pathway to have about a $3.4 trillion loss to the economy over the next 50 years. So that's obviously a significant and compounding loss. So year on year, it is getting worse as the adaptive capacity of the economy diminishes with increasing climate damages. But in starting to move away from that type of pathway into a coordinated, rapid, accelerated net zero timeline, one where you get that sequencing and pace and scale of decarbonisation effort right in Australia alongside the rest of the world, Australia is actually quite competitive. So while there are structural adjustment costs attached to that, what we were seeing in our work is that Australia could get an $890 billion dividend to GDP over the next 50 years from having made that shift. So that being a net benefit to the economy from having made that change to decarbonise. So kind of resetting the economic thinking and that framework in which we start to unpack the economics of climate change in Australia has really led us to what we think is a more productive discussion in terms of the policy settings that can actually get us on that type of pathway. So that's really kind of where I'm coming from with the economics of climate change and what we're thinking about and what we're looking at. And I'm really looking forward to kind of unpacking some more of that in the panel discussion and also hearing from the rest of the panelists on their point of view on the economics of climate.
Fantastic. Thank you, Claire. And I think it is really nice to hear a slightly more positive spin on some of the challenges that we face. You know, there are opportunities as well, and it's nice to focus on that as well. We will now hand the virtual microphone over to Alison Reeve. So take it away, please, Alison.
Great, thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen here because I have some slides. Okay. Okay, so what I wanted to do today is, I think, talk about it's probably sort of, I think, coming down one level of depth from what Claire was just sort of mentioning. And a lot of these insights come from the report series that we've done this year on how Australia could actually get to net zero emissions. It would be nice if that would click through. Okay, great. So just to sort of give a little bit of context about why net zero is important and why, as you know, the world that Australia is finding itself in. Increasingly, countries everywhere are committing to get themselves to net zero emissions by various dates, mostly 2050, some around 2040, some a little bit later. And those pledges are increasingly covering a larger share of global emissions. This chart does not include the countries who made pledges at the recent climate change conference in Glasgow. So you can expect that line on the right-hand side is now higher, and the bar on the left-hand side is now higher as well. Now, why that is important for Australia is that we're an export-driven country. So, and a lot of the exports that we rely on for GDP are really going to be affected by these decisions that are made overseas. So this chart shows you our top 20 export commodities by value in 2019-20. There'll be a little bit of kind of COVID effect in that, which can't be helped. But what you can see here is that there's a number of things that we export, and they're the yellow bars, that aren't going to be affected by what other countries do on climate policy. So it doesn't matter how many countries make net zero pledges, people are still going to want wheat, they're still going to want fruit and nuts, they're probably still going to want gold and beef and so on. But then there's another group of exports which we've shown in red here, which are the ones where net zero commitments by other countries are really going to profoundly affect these exports. And these are basically ones that are fossil fuels, and they produce emissions directly when they're used by whoever we sell them to. And then there's this sort of third group in the middle, which includes iron ore, which is by far and away our most valuable export. And these are things that are feedstocks for emissions intensive processes overseas. So these are ones where you know, other countries, how other countries decide to go about using those may or may not have an impact on our exports. And just to sort of, I guess, hammer home this point a little bit, this is our export, those export flows. So it's those commodities that I had on the previous chart on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, it's where they go. And you can see that most of what we export goes to countries that have made net zero commitments. And in particular, large amounts of those fossil fuel exports go to both Korea and Japan, who have both said that they are going to get their emissions to zero by 2050. So really what that means is that there's two really important industries to Australia, LNG and coal, that are going to shrink. What we've got here is what the IEA forecast in their net zero report earlier this year of what would happen to Australia's LNG exports and to our coal exports. And what you can see is that those exports under those scenarios have peaked, and they are going to fall quite rapidly over the coming decades. And coal in particular is going to shrink to almost nothing. LNG holds up for a while because it is a lower emissions fuel than coal, but it's certainly at nothing like the levels that it is now. Now, that's all very gloomy. Let's talk about some more good news things. As Claire was saying, this is not just about what it costs us, but it's also about what we can gain. And this chart on the left-hand side is literally my favourite chart that I've made all year, because what it shows is that coal, that value of coal, so similar to the chart in the previous slide, but then it also shows what happens to the value of what are called critical minerals over the same time. Critical minerals are those that are going to be used a lot in the energy transition around the world. So these are things like silicon to make solar panels, copper to make electrical wiring, lithium to make batteries, and so on. And I love the way these charts almost exactly mirror each other, that as the global market value of coal falls off a cliff, the global market of critical minerals really, really takes off. And on the right-hand side is a chart from our report that shows what the potential market value of those is for Australia if we keep the same share of global markets as we have now. And what you can see there is that those minerals are potentially worth twice or more than twice to our economy compared to what coal is. So there's actually this massive opportunity sitting here from the energy transition across the world. One other thing I just wanted to talk about as well is why we have to start now. It's very tempting when people talk about, oh yeah, we're going to commit, you know, we have both political parties that have said net zero emissions by 2050. If you're a prime minister or a federal opposition leader, 2050 is 10 elections away, right? That is enough time to lose government, gain government, lose government again. The thing is that in terms of the assets that actually lock in the patterns of emissions across our economy, 30 years is not very long at all. And that's because most of those assets have really long lives. And I've just put an example up here for trucks to show what I mean. If we assume that semi-trailers gradually over time electrify as that technology develops, as it gets cheaper and so on, and such a rate that we get to 50% of the sales of trucks being a net zero emissions truck by 2040 and 100% by 2050. Because the trucks stay on the road for a long time, our fleet of trucks will be nowhere near zero emissions by 2050. It'll be at something just above 40%. Every truck that is bought from now on potentially locks in a pattern of emissions for a very long time. And it is not just trucks. Cars, on average, in Australia, stay on the road for 20 years. Our buildings have an average lifespan of more than 50 years. In fact, if you live in the inner city or you walk around the inner city in Melbourne or Sydney, you will notice that there are a lot of buildings there that are more than 100 years old. And industrial assets have design lives of 30 and 40 and 50 years. And so the decisions that we make over this decade about those assets are going to lock in patterns of emissions for a long time. And they are going to really impact on our ability to get to a net zero goal by 2050. Now, this chart just shows what happens if we do wait. It uses the government's projections for emissions over the coming decade. And you can see a red line at the top there, which is electricity. And they're projecting that electricity, emissions from electricity are going to fall quite rapidly. That's because renewable energy is coming into the mix very fast. But you can see that all the other sectors stay pretty flat. Almost nothing happens. And what that means is that as we start to move towards 2050, well, when we get to 2030, all of those sectors are going to face a very steep fall to get to zero by 2050. And the rate of change that we would be looking at there, if all of those sectors sort of stay where they are by 2030, the rate of change that we're looking at is trying to find emissions that are 3 times Qantas's total emissions every year for 20 years and remove those from the economy. If we start now, we only have to find about twice Qantas's emissions. So that's around, so if we start now, it's about 17 million tonnes a year of abatement that we need to find between now and 2050. If we wait until 2030, it's around 24 million tonnes a year of abatement in Australia to get to 2050. And that's an incredibly disruptive piece of economic change. It would mean a lot of assets having to be forced out. So, you know, some sort of cash for clunkers scheme across the entire economy, which means you're retiring a lot of assets before they get to the end of their economic life. That has a cost. It would also mean that we would be doing a lot of offsetting. So a lot of trying to, you know, plant trees or manage soil carbon or those sorts of things, or potentially even directly just mechanically capture carbon dioxide from the air in order to offset the emissions that we've got, because we've locked in patterns of them by not taking action through the 2020s. So that might be, I think, where I stop. But the things that I really just wanted to give you as take-home messages is that we need to start now. We need to do it in every sector, but we've got solutions that are easily understood, and we should use those. We really need to watch out for long-lived assets, and we should be investing in sectors that will grow during the energy transition rather than shrink.
Fantastic. Thank you, Alison. And I think that's what really struck me just then, is you don't often hear about the asset life of the various assets being discussed when you're talking about the transition to net zero. So I think bringing that focus up front is a really important one. So thank you for sharing that with us. I will now turn over to Dr. Syezlin Hasan. Syezlin, please go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Kim. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak today to Organizing Committee of Women in Economics Network. Thank you very much. I frame my talk today around the kind of research that I'm doing in the space of environmental economics. And this is, I have young people in mind, just try to encourage them to study economics and to help them see what sort of things that I do in my research at Australian Rivers Institute at Griffith University. So let me just share my screen. I have some slides here. I hope it works. So, as you all know, my name is Syezlin Hasan, or people call me Bing for short. I'm a research fellow at the Australian Rivers Institute, Griffith University. I grew up and went to school in Malaysia. And at an undergraduate level, I studied economics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the United States. A couple of years after graduating, I went on to study applied economics at International University Malaysia in Kuala Lumpur. And then I did my PhD in environmental economics at the University of York in the United Kingdom. Briefly, my research here. My research is interdisciplinary, where I use economics to bridge scientific research findings to policy. The combined knowledge, as you can see there, environmental science combined with environmental economics, is used to inform environmental policy. And we know that the ultimate goal of environmental policy is to achieve improved social outcomes as well as improved environmental outcomes. So in the space of climate change that we are talking today, it's crucially important that the impact of climate change will be felt when it comes to protection of the environment. So environmental quality is going to deteriorate much more quicker under the impacts of climate change. So what I've listed in yellow here are the sort of topics or methods within this environmental economics discipline that I typically use in my research. And they involve environmental economic modeling, environmental economic accounting, economic valuation of ecosystem services, which I'm going to talk a little bit in a few minutes, and decision support tools, which includes cost-benefit analysis, cost-effectiveness analysis, and this kind of cash flow analysis. So this is just a brief overview of the sort of work that I've done or I'm doing still. And the first one here is on climate change adaptation in the South Pacific. And I looked at small-scale projects in 15 Pacific Island countries, and those countries are located in the rectangle box in the map there. The next block of work that I've involved in is on the conversion of agricultural land to alternative land uses to improve water quality in the Great Barrier Reef. So this study was done for the dry tropics as well as the wet tropics catchments. And the next block of work is on the research projects funded by SQ Water. So there are several research projects that we've been closely working on with SQ Water colleagues. And one of them is on the estimating population disease burden and monetary evaluation of improvements in public health from SQ Water investments in green infrastructure in catchments to reduce drinking water risk. So green infrastructure investment within the catchment is important for water quality as well as water quantity. And we know that with the drying climate and more erratic climate, that has become even more important. And just for those who are not familiar with the Queensland or SQ Water function in Queensland, SQ Water is a Queensland government bulk water supply authority. They've been tasked with delivering safe, secure and cost-effective water supply to populations living in Southeast Queensland. The next block of work is on the environmental economic accounting for the Mitchell River catchment in far north Queensland. So this is developing and piloting an ecosystem accounts for the river catchment. And the next one is about the wetlands. So my work about the wetlands, specifically looking at the costs and benefits of converting poor agricultural land, poor quality, low productivity agricultural land to wetlands in wet tropics, North Queensland. And this is also important when we are grappling with the impacts of climate change. Yeah. So the next set of slides is for me to talk a little bit more details in terms of what sort of topics or techniques that I use in each of the research that I've shown here today. So for the first one, for the climate change adaptation in the South Pacific, I use environmental economic modeling, skills from or topics or methods from environmental economic modeling, where we model the link between project completion outcome and the drivers of that completion outcome for across 15 Pacific Island countries. And for my work on the conversion of agricultural land to alternative land uses, we used a cost effectiveness analysis to evaluate which land users deliver the best value for money. And then for the work for SQ Water, it is quite involved because there are several projects that we've been working on. And as you can see here, the first block work involves modeling risk exposure. So the risk exposure and try to estimate population disease burden on the exposed population in Southeast Queensland from exposure to pathogens in drinking water. And then the next block of work involves economic evaluation of improvement in population health arising from greater investment in green infrastructure to improve water quality. And then we also did a lot of work to provide a decision support tool for SQ Water to use to guide their investments in green infrastructure. For my work in environmental economic accounting for the Mitchell River in North Queensland, we produced pilot ecosystem accounts, and we produced that by following the guidelines from United Nations System of Environmental Economic Accounting, Ecosystem Accounting. So these guidelines has been undergoing global consultations in the past year, and then prior to that, lots of discussion papers and testing of the guidelines. And the white cover publication has just been published in September this year, so it's finally been finalized. So it's very exciting time to there's a way forward to apply these guidelines in real settings. My final block of work is on the wetlands. So I use economic modeling in the sense that we collect data, standardize the data, and then use that data to estimate a cost function for wetland construction. And also because we are converting agricultural land to wetlands, we need to perform some kind of discounted cash flow analysis to inform the landholders on the return on investment for converting their land. So as you can see here, my research is quite broad-ranging. Yeah. And because it's broad-ranging, it makes it very interesting. And also, learning economics means you get the opportunity to transfer your skills to areas that suit your interests or areas that require urgent action, such as climate change. So the next few minutes, I'm just going to focus a little bit more on my work on climate change adaptation in the South Pacific. As I mentioned previously, we model the links between the project completion outcome and drivers of that outcome. And drivers of those outcomes consist of project attributes, adaptation approach, and location of adaptation activities within those 15 Pacific Island countries. And we all know that climate change is a global threat. And repeatedly during COP26, those representatives from Pacific Island countries, they keep saying that we did not contribute greatly to the climate change, but the impact is severe for us. So it's crucially important to recognize that. And many climate change adaptation projects have already been funded and implemented in small island developing states, but more fundings continue to flow. We saw from the pledges from COP26. So with those more financing coming through, we need to know how effective adaptation projects are in delivering adaptation outcome. So the literature says that it's very difficult to track the effectiveness of a climate change adaptation project. Why is it so difficult? Well, they said there's lack of measurable outcomes, lack of readily definable metric for measuring adaptation success. How do you define reduced vulnerability to the impacts of climate change? Reduced vulnerability to the impact of climate change is an adaptation success, but it's very difficult to measure those. And then also there's a time delay between implementation of on-ground adaptation measures and the delivery of the beneficial outcomes from that work. So it's a very interesting yet challenging field of research for this project. So given that it is so difficult, we thought that maybe the best way is to actually looking at the outcome of the project in terms of whether it's been completed or terminated before completed, because that could be a necessary step towards achieving successful adaptation. So what we found in our research is that longer projects have a lower probability of completion. Adaptation projects in receipt of a higher co-financing cash contribution have a higher probability of completion. Projects that are explicitly targeted towards climate change adaptation have a higher probability of completion. So in the data set, we also include some of the projects that has twin goals like development as well as adaptation. But we found that projects that are explicitly designed towards achieving adaptation outcome have a higher probability of completion. And finally, projects that combined ecosystem-based and hard engineered adaptation approaches have a significantly lower probability of completion compared to projects that use only one adaptation approach, like ecosystem-based adaptation. So that concludes my a little bit about what I do for work. And thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for that, Syezlin. And I think I really like your point that you know, having greater adaptation finance is fantastic, but you do need to know whether or not that's actually successful or not. So I am sure we will come back and speak more about that shortly. But finally, and again, absolutely not least, we will hand over the microphone to Dr. Marit Kragt. Take it away. Thank you, Marit.
Thank you very much, everyone. So I'm going to take a slightly different approach to, I am also going to share some slides. So start finding my screen. I am an interdisciplinary scientist, so I am an economist as well as a scientist. I've trained in environmental science and then also in economics and did a PhD in environmental economics. So all of my work is very interdisciplinary, working as the link between science and policymakers often, and translating science into economics and vice versa. My area of work is the agricultural sector, and I'm the director of the Centre for Agricultural Economics and Development at the University of Western Australia. So I'm going to show you some slides on climate action that's possible in the agricultural sector, with an economic lens on it, but mostly it's just showing you what an applied economist does. So the agricultural sector in Australia is responsible for about 13.5% of Australia's greenhouse gas emissions. Not massive, but still considerable. About 2/3 of those emissions are produced by cattle and sheep through the fermentation of grass and other plant matter in their stomachs. That we call that enteric fermentation. Now, in recent years, Australia's agricultural emissions have gone down, but that is mostly because sheep and livestock numbers have gone down because of the droughts. So if those herd numbers go up again, we may see an increase in agricultural emissions. Other emission sources from agriculture include the decomposition of manure, fertilizer applications, land clearing, burning of crop residues, and a few others. But it's that livestock that's the most important source of emissions, and also a source of methane emissions, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. Now we know that some impacts of climate change are unavoidable. We're already seeing them now, right? And agriculture is probably one of the most vulnerable sectors to climate change effects. Farmers face a wide range of risks, but they're particularly exposed to that variability in climate and commodity prices. So we're already seeing an increase in temperatures, and that is mostly in the on the eastern side of Australia, which is exactly where those productive agricultural areas are. We already also see reductions in rainfall and many more drought events. You can see that on this slide here, a picture of a drought, a dry ground, but also on the right-hand side, rainfall changes over the last 30, 50 years, I mean. You can see that especially on the west coast, which is the Western Australian grain belt, and that eastern half of Australia, there's been an increase of drought periods, and that is exactly where all our agricultural produce comes from. Now that has obviously is going to have an impact on farmers, and this is work that was done by the Australian Bureau of Agricultural and Resource Economics and Sciences that shows that those recent changes in climate already having a large impact on farm profitability. And the main reason that farm profits haven't reduced even more is because of the incredible increase in what we call, as agriculture economists, total factor productivity of the sector. So productivity and the efficiency of resource use has continued to increase over time. But even despite that increase, we're seeing this reduction in profitability of farming because of the impact of droughts and more severe weather events. There's also more frost events that affect harvest. Lots of things that are happening that make the sector particularly vulnerable. Now, Kim asked me to talk a little bit about different strategies that are available for farmers, both in the adaptation space and in the mitigation space. There's a lot of research on helping farmers to cope with these climatic changes. And I'll show you just some examples in case you are not that familiar with the agricultural sector. So these are from Western Australia, where I am based, and there's things like a lot of farmers have already adopted these zero tillage. So it means that you're planting crops without plowing the ground, and that reduces the loss of soil moisture that line should read. We're also extend fallows, so we can capture or reducing fallows, that should read, to capture moisture in the soil. This is an example photo of stubble retention, where you keep your stubble on the ground over summer to avoid soil moisture loss. There's also a lot of research on technologies, new technologies, and increased precision farming, so we can reduce our resource use, reduce fertilizer applications, reduce water loss, because we can be very precise in our applications of fertilizers, herbicides, irrigation. Other things that are available is simply planting later in the season when there's enough water, but also there's scientists working on developing new crop varieties, so that are more suited to drought and climate variations. So it's a little bit about adaptation, but in addition to the need for adaptation, there's also many drivers to mitigate the agricultural sector's emissions. Now, we already know that our federal government is not overly ambitious in achieving mitigation for Australian industries, but most farm industry bodies have set ambitious targets to be carbon neutral. So by 2025, by 2030, and the National Farmers Federation is working towards a net carbon zero by 2050. But possibly even more important is the many agricultural companies and export markets that are calling for emission reductions. So I have a few examples on this slide of supply chain drivers that have called for zero emissions, like Unilever, Fonterra, Kellogg's. So I think that reduction in emissions is going to be driven by these large businesses. The businesses that know that curbing emissions gradually is going to be much less expensive than just cutting emissions drastically later down the track. We also see changes in European Union regulation, like an increase for crop-based biofuels, which is really good for canola farmers, but at the same time, that is linked to targets for climate neutrality. So if we in Australia don't mitigate our emissions when producing crop-based biofuels like canola, we won't have access to that European Union export market for much longer. So I think any changes towards a carbon neutral agricultural sector will probably be driven by these international market pressures. To finish up on, I want to show you a couple of slides on how the agricultural sector can mitigate their greenhouse gases. So you may have heard of carbon sequestration. That's the potential of vegetation and soils to store carbon and to therefore offset any carbon emissions into the atmosphere. And the concept of carbon farming. It's something that a phrase that rose about 11, 12 years ago, that captures just broadly the climate change mitigation practices that farmers can undertake. So under the federal government's emission reduction fund, farmers are eligible to become mitigation providers. There's a set of methodologies that they can undertake, and then they can sell, or they get rewarded with Australian carbon credit units, and they can sell that. And there's also a growing voluntary market, but I'll discuss as part of one of the questions some of the challenges that are involved with participating in that market. The things that are available, and this is the type of stuff that I'm doing research on. There's lots of management practices that can mitigate greenhouse gas emissions and can also sequester carbon. So I have 3 slides, one with practices that can reduce soil carbon loss, but also sequester carbon in soil. We've heard a lot about soil carbon in the recent plan for Australia. And that's stuff like stubble retention, increasing ground covers or using perennials instead of annual crops. Cell grazing is a type of livestock management, conservation tillage, biochar. Other areas to sequester, other ways to sequester carbon is in vegetation, not in soil, but in vegetation. And that is the typical, don't clear your land, plant new trees, farm forestry, managing regrowth. However, we've done it at our university, some research very recently on the trade-offs between planting trees on maybe less productive land and then gaining carbon credits for that versus using that land for production. And that shows that the carbon price would need to be very high, at least $60 per ton, up to $100 per ton to even offset the loss in agricultural land that would come with planting trees. So probably my perspective is, from an economic perspective, any of these vegetation management practices are probably most viable either on marginal lands that are not that productive or in areas where trees grow really fast, which are also highly productive, but because of the favorable conditions for tree growth, that might just offset the loss in agricultural profits. Finally, massive greenhouse gases from agriculture are methane and nitrous oxide. And we're looking in our team at ways to reduce emissions in livestock, so methane, but also emissions from fertilizer application and therefore reduce nitrous oxide emissions through improved efficiency in fertilizer use. We also have people working on feed additives for cattle. You may have heard of the red algae that an Australian business is working on, supported by the CSIRO, that can reduce methane emissions in livestock by over 80%. So that's really exciting. So there's lots of strategies available for farmers to adapt to climate change and to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. And I expect that supply chain drivers will put pressure on the sector to mitigate their emissions. But, and there's always a but, is that participation in this carbon market is very complex. And most farms in Australia are just family-run businesses learning about how to mitigate climate change and how to then participate as a carbon provider is very complex, and that comes at a high transaction cost. So just learning about how to access this market, all the forms you need to fill out, all the things you need to comply with is a huge barrier to participating. And also, we don't yet know what the trade-offs are going to be between taking climate mitigation actions and your potential loss in profit from not using your agricultural land optimally. And then I have a question maybe for the panel, but I see that Kim has also put it on my list to answer, is whether we should use federal funds, so taxpayers' money, to pay farmers for mitigation. Because on the one hand, we have an obligation to reduce each individual's emissions, but on the other hand, farmers provide public benefits in the form of mitigation, but also in the form of maybe biodiversity benefits provided by trees that are planted on their property. So it's something that I'm going to leave open for the discussion. And that's my contact details to finish off with.
Wonderful, thank you for that, Marit. And I really like the overlap between your presentation and Alison's presentation, just really highlighting that there are lots of different sectors in Australia that are actually really vulnerable to whether it's supply chain driven changes or regulation from our export industry. So it's not always about what's happening here in Australia that matters, but it's about what's happening abroad. But I think it does also matter about what's happening here in Australia. And I think that's a good sort of segue into the next session of our event today, which is the moderated panel discussion. And if I'm keeping with this train of thought, I might start with you, Claire, and just, I mean, off the back of your earlier presentation, I just want to know, does the sort of cost benefit analysis that you were talking about earlier, does that change the longer it takes for Australia to sort of start that meaningful shift towards a lower economy? I mean, what does that look like depending on when the start date is?
Yeah, it's a good question, Kim. And I think essentially we're an economy, in particular Australia, where you're a highly emissions intensive kind of industrial base that underpins our economic growth trajectory. When you maintain low and slow ambition, what you are essentially looking is a higher abatement cost for the economy as a whole. But you are looking in kind of a view to pretty much losing out on the upside that would come if you got the competitive advantages or those first mover advantages from being able to change Australia's productive capabilities to basically have what the world wants as it decarbonises. We know now that the majority of Australia's largest trading partners have net zero commitments, albeit at slightly different dates. But that's the signal being set that obviously the world and supply chains are going to reorient themselves to have to be low emissions. And where Australia kind of is not keeping up with that in terms of what we offer the world in terms of our goods and services, you are looking in a higher cost of transition. You're also kind of looking in basically lower adaptive capacity. You're just a less resilient economic structure, both to the physical consequences of climate change and in the face of what will be significant transition risks, because Australia is a small, open, trade exposed economy. And if we are not kind of being at the forefront of that change, we're absolutely locking in a higher cost. And the longer you wait, the higher that cost is over the next kind of 30 years, which is the period that it's going to take to reach that net zero. But we are talking about kind of the next 2 or 3 being the one that locks in the next 10, and that's the one that's going to set you on the path to net zero at least cost.
Yeah, great. And Alison, I mean, you talked quite a bit about this as well. So I'm interested in sort of your thoughts around, can anything be done to speed up this process, especially if what happens in the next sort of 10 years is so crucial for whether or not we can reach net zero by 2050?
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of things that we could actually do now that we understand the technology, we understand what the costs are, and we know that there's actually a lot of things we can do that have a net economic benefit rather than a net cost. So anything that results in greater efficiency of something, whether that's a car engine or an industrial plant or the light bulbs in your house or whatever else, pretty much anything that involves greater efficiency actually has a net benefit, and that can be you can get that within a couple of years. So I mean, we did some work this year on fuel emission standards for cars, so just making the cars that get imported into Australia, making them meet a higher standard in terms of how efficient the engine has to be. And our estimate of that was that you could save people $900 over the next 5 years. So that's actually something that we could do now, because we are the only OECD country who doesn't do this. So there's lots of other countries we could learn from, and it wouldn't just drive up the share of electric vehicles in our fleet, but it would also just improve the efficiency of the other vehicles and save people money on petrol. So it seems kind of a bit of a no-brainer that we don't do that stuff. I think if you look at where the current federal government policy focus is, it has a focus on technology, but and that's quite welcome, but it's very focused on the things that are going to be really important in 2040, not the things that we can do now. So policy drivers to bring forward the stuff that we already know how to do and that could actually end up saving us money should really be where we put our effort.
Yeah, great. And Marit, I mean, to me, this just raises the sort of question of relying on these top-down policies to spark change versus, as you were talking about, it's the sort of bottom-up policies in the agricultural sector that you think are going to gain traction. How important do you think those strategies are for the agricultural sector and Australia's emissions reductions more broadly, compared to the sort of top-down action that often gets a lot of focus?
I think it's safe to say that we can't expect too much top-down action on climate change from the current government, and it's politically really hard to show any plans on climate change mitigation, and the business sector is streaming ahead on targeting carbon neutrality, and the farming sector is following that movement as well. As I showed on one of my slides, there is the Meat and Livestock Australian red meat industry has a very ambitious target to be carbon neutral. So that's the pork industry. And there's also many regional farming groups that are working really hard on changing perceptions and practices. There's Ag Zero 2030, Farmers for Climate Action. And I think farmers recognize that to keep access to our export markets, we need to change. We need to be on the front foot. We need to be better than any other exporters to be able to continue to export. And export is our primary income earner for the agricultural sector in Australia.
And Claire, I know you've also worked closely with businesses in terms of their policies to reduce emissions, and your work directly influenced the Business Council of Australia's support for Australia transitioning to net zero by 2050. Do you think was there a particular turning point for the BCA, and how do you feel businesses more generally are placed to drive that transition to net zero by 2050?
Well, I mean, I think what we've seen in Australia and just in the past 3 years has been such a significant shift, and obviously the BCA and their membership demonstrates that kind of from going from one view to a new position on what net zero would mean. And economics and financial markets has a massive role in that. It's really been able to demonstrate based on kind of risk premiums and the view to the need to reallocate capital sooner rather than later for it to have a meaningful role in terms of creating low emissions industries and economic opportunity, and really coming back to a view that that's ultimately about profitability in the long term and sustainability as an industry or a business. Kind of going back to that other point, they have to be able to keep up with what the world wants. And the world has set that end goal and that economic end game as one that is net zero. The timing of it maybe is a question mark still, but the direction is clear and the rate of change to get there has to be clear. And we've seen capital markets move really, really quickly and influence that in such a short period of time. So that policy positioning is one of just a practical economic and kind of business reality at this point, which, it's made it kind of inevitable at this point, just from that perspective. But within that, as we were saying before, there are lots of questions around what is the best path, the most efficient path, the least cost kind of way to do it. But there is kind of an inevitability now in terms of the direction and the rate. But it's still that compositional question about how we get there. But we are seeing businesses leading the way. And I think the COP26 was probably the first COP where we saw business kind of leading that push there as well.
Yeah, you make a good point with that, and it's probably a good segue to head to you, Syezlin. I mean, if we go back to what we were talking about earlier between adaptation and mitigation, at COP26, we did see, as you were saying, a lot more finance pledges for adaptation projects. But do you think that will actually help these small island states that you've been looking at attract more finance? And possibly even more importantly, is getting the finance in the first place the most important aspect, or are there other things that need to be considered as well?
Yeah, thank you very much, Kim, for the question. I definitely think that attracting finance is one of the most important elements of an adaptation project, certainly. Yeah, many adaptation projects receive funding mobilized through the United Nations Framework Convention of Climate Change, or UNFCCC that we know. And those funding come from Global Environment Facility or through bilateral funding arrangements. During COP26, developed countries, as you said, committed significantly increased funding through UNFCCC. So this pledge for increased funding should hopefully translate into more on-ground adaptation activities in small island developing states, particularly in least developing countries, because they're most vulnerable to the impact of climate change. However, whilst obtaining funding should undoubtedly contribute towards delivering an adaptation outcome, securing additional funding as cash contributions from other donors will enable project to be upscaled, which is critically important. So with all these extra pledges coming in from COP26, 2016, hopefully that will make it easier for these people to attract finance. And what I found from my research is that adaptation projects that receive additional cash contributions from multiple sources, be they international or local, had a higher probability of being satisfactorily completed. This is likely because cash contributions towards an adaptation project indicate increased ownership and buy-in to the project. Yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. And Marit, you also focus a lot on the sort of adaptation, and you did touch on it in your presentation just then, but can you kind of explain a little bit more maybe about what adaptation looks like for the agricultural sector and why it's just so important?
It's central to being able to continue farming, right? The temperatures will keep going up, droughts will keep increasing, we'll have more and more frost events, we'll have more and more severe rainfall events. That we saw that with the flooding just very recently, where farmers were in the middle of harvest and their harvest just washed away. So adaptation in the ag sector, there is a lot of research going on this. It really is about new crop varieties, changing your practices to be more, to make use of the moisture in the soil. It's also changing to different areas of the country. So where we see in the wheat belt, for example, in the Western Australia wheat belt, less and less land available in the eastern parts because it just becomes too dry. But there's also research on new native crops that can be used as feed for sheep and livestock in the north, but also in the eastern wheat belt. And the benefits of these crops is that they also have properties that can reduce methane emissions. So there is opportunities available, but I do think that there's a huge risk for the agricultural sector if we don't curb ongoing climate change, because at some point crops just won't continue to grow.
Absolutely. And Alison, if we sort of shift our focus back to mitigation for a second, you've discussed the importance of using sort of high quality offsets or high integrity carbon offsets to sort of as a part of the move to net zero. Do you think the COP26 agreement on Article 6 will help to increase the credibility of the offsets that are out there in the market?
Okay, so I should probably just explain what Article 6 is for people who haven't met it before. Article 6 is the part of the Paris Agreement that governs the international trade in carbon credits. So this is where someone undertakes an activity like some of the things that Marit talked about in her presentation. And you do that in one country, but then you have someone in another country who wants to buy that credit and count it towards their target. Now, one sticking point in international trading credits for a long time was that some countries wanted to be able to count the activity towards their target, but then also sell it to somebody else. So we had a double counting problem, effectively. One of the things that did get resolved at Glasgow was that double counting issue. So people now have to choose, but they do get a choice about whether they sell the activity to someone else, about whether they count it towards their local target. The thing is that offsetting more generally, so this act of kind of, instead of reducing your own emissions, paying someone else to reduce theirs, has had a reputational problem for a long time. One aspect of that is what's called additionality. So that's a test as to whether the activity would have happened anyway, and you're just paying people to do something that was business as usual. That's always been really fraught. It's actually really hard to prove because we don't have a sort of a whole parallel universe where the only intervention we make is by paying someone or not paying someone to see what would have happened. And under the sort of agreements that came before Paris, so the Kyoto Agreement and so on, there were lots of credits that were created that weren't additional. One thing that was agreed at Glasgow was a transition pathway to get those dodgy credits out of the system, and also to have more stringent criteria for later projects. So that will go some way towards, I think, mending the reputation of offsets. In the Australian context, our debate tends to be around whether offsets are being used as an excuse to avoid change. So are people just choosing to offset instead of actually reducing their emissions? And Article 6 kind of doesn't really help us with that. We need to have better policy settings here. If you look at the ALP announcement that was made on Friday, that had pretty generous provisions in it for offsetting. And if you look at the government's plan, they were planning on having somewhere around 15% of getting to net zero coming from offsets. We are going to need offsets because there are some emissions that are very difficult to remove, that will be very expensive to stop doing, or where we'll eventually find a solution for them, but we won't get there in time for 2050. And that's where offsets can play a role. But in the Grattan Institute's view is that you need to design your policies so that you get people to reduce their emissions first and then use offsets for what you can't do. The reason for this is every tonne that goes into the atmosphere from now on is contributing to making global warming worse, even if you offset it. So the tonne that you don't emit is the one that you don't have to offset, and it's the one that doesn't push global temperatures up. So we really should be focusing on emissions reductions first, with offsets being for the little bits that are left over.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you for that. Syezlin, I know a lot of your work focuses on putting an economic value on the environment, and I think this has sometimes been a bit of a challenge for economists because our sort of traditional frameworks haven't really been designed with that thought in mind. Why do you think it's so important that we find ways to adequately measure the economic value of the environment?
Right, thank you, Kim. Well, we all know that there is a growing recognition that natural environments provide many benefits to our economy and our well-being. Yeah. So environmental economists use the concept of ecosystem services to represent the flow of value from natural environments on one hand here, and then the human society. So the flowing from environment to the society here. And viewing the environment and the economy, or the society and economy, as an integrated human environment system. So they are linked, very much interlinked together. So framing it this way, through an ecosystem service lens, enables arguments to be made for public policies that will aim to protect the environmental quality. And we know that high environmental quality underpins our economic growth and improves our standards of living. And the natural environment can be viewed as comprising different types of ecosystem. If you think of my hand here as environment, and there are different types of ecosystem that comprise the environment here. And for example, we choose, say, coastal wetlands. Yeah. Coastal wetlands deliver a range of important ecosystem services, such as protection of lives and property from storm surges, carbon sequestration and storage, nutrient removal for water quality regulation, and nursery habitats for juvenile fish. Another example is the importance of rivers and lakes that support delivery of recreational opportunities like kayaking and fishing, provisioning ecosystem service in the form of fish harvest and water supply for our drinking water and for industrial use, as well as regulating services such as water purification, erosion prevention, and so on. So ecosystems such as coastal wetlands, forests, shrublands, grasslands, and floodplain marshes can be regarded as natural assets. They are as important as the structures that Alison was talking about, the buildings that we have. They are as important, and we should take care of them and manage them appropriately, because we want to maintain those environments in good condition. So only when they are in good condition can they continue the delivery of these benefits that we really enjoy. We can't wait to go on holiday and enjoy clean water, sit by the river. Yeah, so we can't wait to go fishing for some of us. So we need to maintain those in good condition well into the future. So going back to your question, Kim, about the value of the environment. So the value of the environment can be measured by quantifying that flows from the environment to the economy. And that quantification, that flow, we call it ecosystem services. That quantification of the ecosystem services is important because number one, they help us understand the value we derive from the environment. We have to see that in dollar terms as well, alongside our other manufactured assets. And number two, these values can be published alongside standard national accounts so that environmental contribution to the economy and the society are visible. And also thirdly, they can be used to inform decision-making by governments, businesses, and the community. So once the value of ecosystems contributions to society and the economy are visible to decision makers, that should help hopefully promote more informed management of the environment.
Thank you. And Marit, I know you're doing very similar things in terms of, trying to value these non-market impacts. Can you explain a little bit more about how you're going about that work?
Yeah, good introduction, Syezlin. So I'm also a non-market valuation expert. So for those of you who don't know, non-market valuation is what Syezlin just explained, putting a value on environmental goods and services. And that's in the agricultural sector is core, right? It's what's the value of improved soil health, what's the value of biodiversity, and that could be the value for my crop yield, but it's also a public value that's provided, which was just explained. So we use, as non-market valuation economists, we use stated preference techniques and revealed preference techniques because those markets currently don't exist. We rely on preferences that are revealed through the choices that people make. And that can, or the stated preferences from people. And we have, 30 years of research on different surveying methods, essentially, to see what the trade-offs are that people make between choosing for environmental protection or choosing to use their money differently. You can look at recreational choices that people make. Do I go fishing at this spot or at this spot? And is there a difference in environmental quality between those two spots? If there is, and we control for everything else, then the increased visitation to the more pristine spot potentially is the value of that pristineness. Now, I obviously can't in one answer explain the whole discipline of non-market valuation, but there is proven methods to try to account for those values, try to estimate those values, I should say, because in this Western culture, what doesn't get a value, what doesn't get measured, doesn't get included in the decision making. Now, while we are able to do that first step, estimate those values, I don't think we're able to do the second step, incorporating that value in decision making. We haven't yet internalized those external costs and benefits, right? To some extent in carbon markets, carbon offset markets, biodiversity offsets, but not completely. That's why we have environmental taxes and subsidies. That's why we have ecosystem services markets, but it's by not yet mature those markets. There's a long way to go.
I think looking at the time, it's probably a good chance to switch over into some of the audience questions that are coming in, and there are plenty of them, so it's good to see. But I think there's a question from Lisa that sort of lends itself to what we've just been talking about. So I might ask Marit and Syezlin what your thoughts are on this, but Lisa's just wondering, sort of, given that we need to reform our economic approach to climate change, what do you think that the teaching of economics should change to sort of make sure that students' understanding of economic growth and economic development is properly framed to include climate change, which is speaking for myself, was never a part of my tertiary education at all. So how do you think that the education part of economics can change to include that better?
Oh, can I start? Yeah,
yes, of course.
The caveat is that I don't have an undergrad in economics. I only did a master's. So I don't actually know what's being taught in the undergrad. But at our school, we do teach into the undergrad of economics. We teach environmental economics, in which we exactly explain to students these ideas of the value for the environment. How can we measure the environment? How can it be incorporated into decision making? What's a carbon tax or a subsidy? And so from my perspective, those sort of courses should be part of the economics core. Every economist should have heard of circular economy and what does that mean, right? And if it's not yet included in your undergraduate teaching, then it probably should.
Yeah, the economics I went through in the undergraduate here, I just learned all the theory and with the standard topics within that, where you look at the circular flow economy without paying too much attention on the environment. And it's basically on manufactured assets and the services that we get from those goods and services produced in the economy, the standard macroeconomics and microeconomics theories and principles, and that been extended to intermediate levels and the advanced levels. And then environmental economics is just been put aside as an additional course that you can take to, if you're interested. So it's not been made a compulsory course, but I think there's a big role to play here where, as Marit was saying, we can slowly integrate the theory, climate change topics, environmental economics topics, agriculture, to give a bit more perspective when we're teaching the undergraduates, especially the first year students. They need to see the relevance of what they're studying to the real world problems that they are trying to understand and trying to solve. So I think that's a way forward, rather than leaving it as a separate course to take for those who are interested.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. The second question that's come through, I think I will throw to Alison and Claire to get your thoughts on this. But Isabella's asking if you think that Australia can reach net zero by 2050 without a carbon tax, and whether or not tariffs from our sort of major trading partners could be enough to incentivize a move away from the emissions heavy goods and services that we create in the absence of a carbon tax.
Cool. We're gonna need something. And I mean, I think the thing to remember at the moment is we actually have several different prices on carbon around the economy at the moment. It's just so we just don't have one single price. So things like the Emissions Reduction Fund, which Marit mentioned in her presentation, puts a price onto emissions reductions. The renewable energy target effectively imposes a price. The state-based policies impose various prices and so on. The question I think you need to answer when you're talking about should we have a carbon tax or a single economy-wide carbon price, when you actually grapple with the reality of implementing that, it's very, very difficult to make it completely economy-wide, because the number of people who have to get involved and actually calculate their emissions from various activities suddenly gets very, very, very large, and it becomes very difficult to do. And so sometimes you actually need to segment things up and just say, you know, there are some places where a carbon price is not really going to flow through to a behavioural change, and we need to do something different. And I mean, the long-lived asset problem that I talked about previously is actually an example of that. That sometimes something like a standard that ratchets down over time can just take the emissions out without needing to do price signals. Because you're talking about a piece of kit that exists for a long time, it can actually be more effective than trying to put a price onto things. The question about trade partners is interesting. As some people might know, the European Union is talking about doing what's called a carbon border adjustment mechanism, where they will tax certain goods on the way into the EU when they're imported based on the carbon that's embodied in them. The thing about those border adjustment mechanisms is that they're only compliant with the WTO rules if your domestic producers are also facing a similar price. And so that means the number of things that Australia produces that will be affected by that mechanism is actually quite small, because we don't export a whole lot of stuff to the EU, and of the things that we export that will be affected by the carbon border adjustment mechanism is actually a lot smaller again. What is interesting, though, is that actually is indicative of a broader shift in policy, and in also, I think, in how companies are thinking about emissions, is that they're starting to think about their supply chain, not just the stuff that they're responsible for. And that really, I think, potentially changes the pattern of incentives along the chain, particularly where you've got very large companies involved in supply chains who are suddenly saying to their suppliers, we want to know where your carbon, how much carbon is involved in what you're doing, because that's important to us now.
Do you have any? Sorry.
Yeah, I would just quickly add to that, Alison, that the carbon price is already there. It's just arguably not that kind of efficient, consistent, or centrally done in a way that most people would kind of expect or recognise. A structured and regulated pricing mechanism. But even just based on consumer behaviour changes and what people are choosing to buy or not, they are actually imposing a price on something that is more emissions intensive the more they choose to not buy it. So, and businesses, large industries and firms are already kind of having carbon prices in their commercial decisions and their commercial analysis on what to build or not to build, what to fund or not to fund. So it is already there, but it is kind of all over the place, which makes it inherently inefficient. And the biggest downside for Australia in particular is the government. Governments don't necessarily collect revenue from it as a more kind of structured taxation style mechanism. So you're kind of losing an upside component that would come with a price that's essentially already there. But also, to Alison's point, it is incredibly difficult to make it this kind of uniform regulated thing at this point in time in particular as well. But it is there, but we are going to need to do something better to get to that kind of efficiency and get the pace and scale and sequencing of the transition right, but also enable governments to actually have a revenue base that potentially comes from that, as those other aspects of the revenue base start to disappear as well, based on just the changing demand profile for certain goods in the economy. So, like all good economists, we tend to say it depends when we answer questions, but this is one of those ones where it really does depend. But I think anyone would be kind of in a collective agreement that what we currently have is probably not going to be good enough to get us there in the least cost way that everyone thinks we need.
And actually what you're just saying then about the sort of revenue base ties in very nicely to a question that we've got in from Joffrey. So he's just saying that, is there a big risk that if you pursue a carbon or a GHG price to sort of cap and trade and tax, you actually end up getting quite a big wealth transfer from consumers and households who are essentially paying the taxes to the corporations and governments. And if that does exist, how is it managed?
I think that just depends on how you design it. So I mean, we did have a fairly comprehensive carbon price in Australia for a year and a half. And the way that was designed was that the revenue is explicitly returned to households, and also some of it was put into structural adjustments, so into helping industry to move away from high polluting activities towards low polluting activities. So a lot of that just comes down to design features. I guess the other thing you need to think about too when you talk about a wealth transfer to government doesn't just put all that money in a big room and sit on it forever. It spends it on stuff, right? That's the role of government, is to spend money on stuff that benefits all of us. So I think a lot of that just comes down to design features rather than being something that you necessarily should worry about. There are ways that you can do carbon pricing such that you don't get any revenue for government, but that then has the downside that there is less ability for the government actually to do those compensating to transfers to people who are strongly affected. So like under the previous version of the Australian carbon price, there was a thing called the Clean Energy Supplement or something like that just went to everybody who had a healthcare card. And so they just got a little bit extra of that revenue to recognise that because they were in lower income brackets, the price impacts were going to be probably higher on them because they had less discretionary income. And if you design a carbon price so that you've got no revenue, you can't do that sort of compensation. So you've kind of got to think about it from both perspectives.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. Marit, there's a specific question in here for you. Tom is asking whether farmers are allowed to harvest mature trees for timber products and keep their ACCUs.
No, there's safeguard mechanisms in the legislation. So when you sign up and you want to sell your carbon credits as ACCUs, so the Australian carbon credit units, you will have to the trees that you plant will have to be permanent plantings, and permanent is defined as either 25 years or 100 years. So we can argue whether 25 years is permanent, but at least 25 provides a lower barrier to actually participating in the scheme than the previous 100 years did. And if you commit to 25 years, then you get a lower carbon price than if you commit to 100 years. But during those 25 years, you're not allowed to harvest any of the trees.
There's also a specific question here for you, Alison, from Bronwyn. So when we think about exports, do we also factor in the emissions costs of the exporting activity itself, or is that not material?
The answer is it depends. If you look at what the sort of highest endpoint sources of emissions are in the economy, electricity is at the top by a long shot, but second to electricity is cars, then cows, then deforestation, and then you start to get into the emissions that occur here from fossil fuel production. And I think this is something that's sometimes a little bit underappreciated. We all sort of understand that when we burn fossil fuels, you get emissions, but also just producing them causes a lot of emissions, and those are actually quite large sources of emissions for us, and they're currently not priced in any way into the value of our exports, or in a sort of a supply chain sense from other countries either. So one of the things that happens when if our LNG exports fall, for example, is our emissions here will also fall, because there's a lot of CO2 that goes into the atmosphere just from the process of making LNG. And those emissions sit on our accounts, not on the accounts of people who are burning the gas.
And I'm going to sneak in one final question if someone wants to try and give a 30-second answer before we're out of time. But Lisa's asking, what do we know about policies that have been successful to support workers' transition from obsolete sectors to sort of the greener sectors of our economy? If anyone wants to have a stab at that one.
I can have a quick stab, because we've done a lot of work on this in particular, and the main thing is you actually have to give them something to transition into. So in Australia, a lot of our regional high emission intensive industrial bases are just that. They're regional, they're place-based, and they lack kind of that diversity of economic activity to actually transition into something else. So kind of the evidence really being in Australia in particular, the sooner you make the decision on what that decarbonisation pathway is going to look like, the sooner you need to start providing those alternative pathways, of which the skills of today's workforce are pretty well set up to transition into something else. But that new economic activity really does have to be created. And in the absence of that, you will have a gap and arguably kind of leave those workers behind, which no one would say is a good economic outcome, but it is solvable.
I would say if you want to see an example of where it's actually being done well, if you look at Newcastle. So when BHP pulled out of Newcastle, that pulled a massive amount of economic activity out of that city, but there was a real and concerted attempt over about a 25-year period to transition Newcastle away from being a company town that relied on BHP to being something that was a diverse regional city, which is what it is now. So I think the thing to remember, and I think this is why Claire is right to emphasize that you need to make the decision soon, is because it takes a long time to change the economic mix somewhere, and to, you know, to give new industries time to grow so that people can move into them and that sort of stuff. It is doable, and we have actually done it with somewhere like Newcastle. It's just that it takes a huge amount of effort and you need to start early.
Thank you so much. And with that, we are out of time for today's event. So I'd first like to thank all the panelists for joining us today. It was an incredibly interesting conversation, and I think it just really reinforces that we are running out of time and we need to start making this transition as soon as possible. And thank you all for joining us today. Thank you for the amazing questions. Apologies for those that we didn't get to. As always, there's never enough time, but it's just the start of the conversation. So hopefully we can continue this at another time. But enjoy the rest of your Monday. Thank you so much for joining us on behalf of New South Wales and Victoria When. Have a great day. Bye.